So, to finalize from my side, I would like to remind us the words of Mr. Panchenko, who always tells that we have to do our homework. So, in fact, we hear that we do sometimes our homework, and we do it not very well. That it's not accepted as good done for homework. But still, we insist that this year is the situation of to be or not to be with Ukraine. And I would like to address my questions to A.Paul, that we have different scenarios which we discussed the whole day. That, for example, we can have imitations from the government, which can be perceived by the Europeans that they are real deeds. And in this case, this is a situation when European loses, Ukraine wins. We can have the situation of win-win when when we do not imitations, but we do all our homework step by step. Every tiny thing we fulfill, or if we don't achieve the progress, we explain why we don't achieve the progress, and if we cannot explain why we don't achieve the progress, we can explain what we do after the signing of the agreement. Then it's win-win situation. The President Yanukovych can have it as a slogan for his presidential election campaign, Euro integration, and that will be fine for Europe and fine for Ukraine. And we have lose-lose situation when we can have lose-lose situation when we have the scenario of Eurasian direction when the agreement is not signed. What do you think about that possible scenarios and how to avoid them?
Okay, thank you. First of all, I would just like to apologise a bit for my voice because I have a cold, so I hope it will manage to hold out for the duration of this event. I mean, Alexander said so much that I'm not sure there's really that much actually left for me to say. It does seem like we have been talking about the association agreement for a very, very, very long time, and I guess for that reason alone it would be very nice to have it signed, so we wouldn't have to have these sort of discussions anymore. Will they, won't they, will they, won't they? In a way it reminds me a bit of the whole debate over Turkey's accession to the EU, because it's almost become almost such a decisive issue within the EU, something that you have big divisions between member states. What we're going to do with Ukraine, in a way, what were we going to do with Turkey, which of course, but that's a different debate. But I think it's clear that if you turn back the clock 1 year, there's a very different approach now from both Ukrainian side and from the EU side. I mean, 1 year ago, the EU's policy towards Ukraine, I would say it was quite chaotic. There wasn't a really clear approach. You had a lot of divisions between member states, but also within the EU institutions themselves and the External Action Service, etc. I don't think we have that situation anymore. I think there's a much clearer policy. You have a far more cohesive approach. You don't have so many voices shouting out, we shouldn't be going ahead with Ukraine anymore, obviously with the exception of Elmar Brok, but his voice is becoming less and less. I agree with Alexander. There has been some progress from the side of Ukraine. They seem to have woken up in 2013. Maybe they have begun to recognise more the importance of what's going to happen at the Vilnius summit. I'm not sure whether that's really to do with the association agreement itself, or whether it's to do with the fact that basically they don't want to be the only country that won't receive anything, and how humiliating that would be actually for Ukraine and for President Yanukovych, because let's face it, with the exception of Belarus, all the other countries on track to actually have some sort of progress in Vilnius, even Azerbaijan, although that might come as a surprise to some of you in the audience. Of course, Azerbaijan won't be signing or initialing an agreement, but they are now negotiating or in the process of working on a strategic partnership, and will also likely sign a visa facilitation agreement in Vilnius. So you would have Ukraine in the corridor, the former leader, with everybody else getting something else. So perhaps this is, partially an element in a change of position in Kiev, or a so-called change of position. I have to say that I have some hesitation as to whether there's a real genuine approach to this new reform process in the country. Mr. Kluyev declared that all of the remaining reforms would actually be carried out by the end of this month. And we only have, a very short period of time to go. And this seems like a very highly unlikely scenario to be realized. But you never know with Ukraine, but still it seems quite unlikely. But I guess there's still, several months to go after that where progress can be made. But at the end of the day as well, it's not just about pushing through reforms in the Rada. It's actually about doing it in a transparent and inclusive way with proper stakeholder consultation, and then making sure that these reforms are actually implemented afterwards. And to say that you would have a track record of implementation, a good implementation of reforms in Ukraine, I would say is it's not something Ukraine is well known for, frankly speaking. But that said, I do think Ukraine will show some positive results. They're certainly not going to meet all of the EU criteria that was laid down. I think that would be very realistic. And I don't think that the EU actually expects Ukraine to meet all of the criteria. I think probably if they were around 60 or 70% and have tackled some of the key areas related to the judiciary, the electoral law reform and constitutional reform, this could be enough to satisfy the EU. On the issue of selective justice, of course, there's still a question mark here. Okay, they've made some progress, they released Mr. Lutsenko and others, but still the issue of what's going to happen with Yulia Tymoshenko remains unanswered. But we can see over the last few months there's been less talk about Yulia Tymoshenko coming from Brussels and other EU capitals, or most EU capitals. It sort of died down a bit. The negative discourse on this issue has reduced. Again, if you would go back 1 year, it was still quite a dominating issue. But again, we're waiting really for the report of the European Parliament monitoring mission, which will be released in September. And when we have their ideas or their conclusions on how Ukraine is addressing the issue of selective justice, particularly vis-a-vis Mrs. Tymoshenko, I guess the EU I think it's the next foreign ministers meeting either at the end of September or in October, will draw their own conclusions on this, which will be quite critical in this process. But I think I'm more optimistic about the actual signature of this document than Alexander, because I do think the EU finds itself in quite a difficult position. Because if they say, okay, we're not going to sign it because Ukraine hasn't met all of the criteria, this does reflect a sort of failure of the Eastern Partnership policy, even if you do have Moldova and Georgia, etc., initialing documents. Because let's be frank, not to put down these countries, but they can't be compared to Ukraine in terms of their importance, in terms of the relationship that the EU has had and still has with Ukraine, the various different areas where the two cooperate. It's a very deep and structured relationship already. Ukraine is very important for the cohesion of this entire region. If Ukraine is left unstable, it impacts on the entire region, which is a significant consideration for the EU, which will, I believe, at the end of the day, play into its decision. I know that the EU likes to say we don't want to trade values for geostrategic importance. But actually, if you look at the broader picture, where you do have countries that are of geostrategic importance, within the Eastern Partnership, but beyond, the EU does regularly trade values. Of course, it's a difficult decision to make because the EU will be branded perhaps by some quarters of not meeting its key principal core values, of course, but I think this is why perhaps there'll be a sort of view on the sort of reforms that Ukraine has made or hasn't made, that it would be enough for them to proceed, but perhaps attach the signing of the association agreement to some sort of conditionality or provisions that would meet perhaps the concerns of some of the countries that have been particularly outspoken on why this agreement shouldn't be signed. Also, if it remains unsigned, we don't know if it will ever be signed. I mean, particularly in its current form. First of all, because 2014 is going to be a totally lost year. I mean, for the EU, that you're going to have a new commission, you're going to have a new parliament, it's going to be busy with internal issues. Ukraine is going to be totally focused on heading towards presidential elections. So you could end up with a new president that wants to renegotiate the entire agreement, or within that time period as well, something could happen to change the external policies of Ukraine. Of course, you could say that would be linked to Russia. That's always the argument that's made, but it's a risk. It's a risk for the EU. That's what I'm saying. And the last argument that I would say would probably be a factor as well is the fact that the EU doesn't want to end up blamed again after you had the failed Orange Revolution. The EU was blamed significantly afterwards. I lost count of the amount of times I heard, if the EU had supported the new government there afterwards, things could have been different. If they'd given a membership perspective, the reform process in Ukraine would have worked, the country wouldn't have fallen to bits. I don't think, I think there's a concern in some circles in the EU, if they don't sign this agreement, something will happen in the country, and EU will be left again with a historical baggage of saying, if the EU had signed the association agreement, it could have made all the difference. It could have kept Ukraine, within the EU's sphere of influence, as you like to say, because it represents a clear geostrategic choice for Ukraine, because it rids us of this whole Euro-Asian issue. It sort of neuters the Russian effect. And I don't think the EU really wants to be burdened with being blamed for where Ukraine might or might not go in the event that they wouldn't sign the agreement. I think the EU really does need to take, as I said earlier today, a leap of faith, not for Ukraine's political elites, but for Ukrainian society, which I think deserve to have the support of the EU. And this is why I believe at the end of the day, even if Ukraine hasn't met all of the criteria, you still have gaps. The risk of not signing the agreement and what might happen thereafter is far greater than actually signing it and perhaps taking some criticism from some quarters. But of course you could say the EU has not had a consistent approach to any of the countries in the Eastern Partnership. A more for more approach I don't think it's worked particularly effectively. So for me personally, I don't think there would be a massive loss in taking the risk and signing the agreement. Then they've done everything they can, in my opinion, to help Ukraine to get onto the right track, and after that it's really into the hands of Ukrainian government to push the process further forward.
Okay, thank you very much. It's again, we hear repeated very interesting and very attractive point for us in Ukraine, that in any case European authorities, they don't want to be burdened with the blaming in the future that they lost the chance for Ukraine. Nevertheless, this is the lost chance for Europe also.